Alright, guys, this is part three, I promise, last part. Um, if you haven't watched part two or part one, please go back and watch those. Make sure you do this in order. Okay, so we're picking back up with what the genre conventions of a speech look like. So these are in no way all of the genre conventions of a speech, but generally speaking, when we look at speeches as a whole, this is what you'll see most often. So the first one is that speeches are usually made to persuade an audience of something. Generally speaking, you don't give up and get up and make a speech that isn't intended to persuade an audience of something. Even if it's something like an Oscars acceptance speech, it's still meant to persuade the audience of some sort of thing. If any of you guys saw Ricky Gervais's I think it was Oscars acceptance speech. It might have been one of those other award shows. He got really, really, really political and persuasive, and it actually made a lot of people angry. But in fact, a lot of speeches are made to persuade an audience. So a language in a speech will also change according to who the audience is. It might be formal, it might be professional, like Dr. Fauci's speech to the NIH, or it could be more informal or funny, often like an Oscars acceptance speech is. Most speeches have an introduction, a middle with the main points, and then a conclusion. It's kind of structured like an essay, actually, almost like a persuasive essay. Or an argumentative essay, which we'll be writing later this semester. And then speakers will also often use hand gestures, voice projection, and visual presentations. So in a lot of your speeches, you will see almost ubiquitously people using hand gestures. So talking with their hands a lot because it's more dynamic. When you're up in front of an audience and talking to them, you want them to have some sort of movement to hang on to. And so that's one of the bad things about teaching over Zoom is that I use a lot of hand gestures and they don't translate well when you're talking into a webcam. So we'll see how that goes. Voice projection, by that I just mean either they're like yelling. So when you're thinking of the speech in Braveheart, for example, he has to yell to his men so that they hear him, or using a microphone if you're giving like a normal speech, like a college commencement address. And then visual presentations might include like a PowerPoint. That will be used by a lot of people, like in TED Talks, for example. They'll use PowerPoint presentations. Okay, so then we've got stance. So your stance is your attitude towards the topic or the speaker's attitude towards the topic. You want to think about, do they have negative feelings about this topic or positive? And in order to find out, do they have negative or positive feelings about it, you'll want to look at what kinds of words they're using to describe it. Your stance might also be something like informal versus formal. Sorry, that is my cat yowling in the background. It might be whether or not you're using really flowery descriptive language versus really sterile kind of scientific language. So you can look at this example of a tweet that Donald Trump wrote about some congresswomen, and this is a good one to look at to see what kind of stance he has about this topic. So he says, so interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world. And so in that initial tweet, you can see words like catastrophe, worst, corrupt, inept. So obviously he doesn't have a very positive view of the topic. And they're vicious. These women are vicious. And so that's obviously, he's got both a negative view towards these women and towards the countries where maybe their families are from, or they might be their places of birth. And then you can compare that to the words that he uses to describe the United States. So his stance towards the United States is quite different. Describes it as greatest, powerful, so really, really great adjectives to describe a very positive view of the United States. You can also think about what his stance means for the purpose of his tweets. So what do you think his purpose is? I think it's probably to drum up some pushback for the policies that these women support. Also, you can think about what that means genre conventions wise, and the fact that normally, as far as presidential addresses go, presidential statements go, this doesn't fit genre conventions of what we would normally see from a president. As in, we wouldn't normally see a president using this kind of language to talk about a fellow politician, even someone who might not have the same views or support the same policies as he does. So this is an example analysis for you to do about a Barack Obama speech on climate change. I just kind of chose this randomly because it was very, very short and easy to get on a PowerPoint slide. But it does offer a good example of how you can break down a speech to find the rhetorical situation. So you can look at who the audience is, what the purpose of it is, break down language level, how many times he uses we, and why he might do this, and the kind of emotional language he uses to inform you of what the stance is, and of course ending in that call to action, which will become really important as we move forward talking about speeches. So you can read through all that information yourself. And then lastly, we want to end with this question of why the rhetorical situation is important beyond just your own essay that you're going to be writing, because I did promise you that the rhetorical situation is something that is going to affect you going forward in your whole life, really. So the best way I can describe this is that if you understand the rhetorical situation, you will understand all of your assignments in college going forward, even in your workplace going forward. So if you keep these questions in mind, it's really easy to break down what does my professor want and how can I accomplish it. So for purpose, obviously you ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why does my professor want me to do this? Why does the, GRE want me to do this? Why does my employer want me to do this? You think about the audience, so who am I doing this for? What kind of professor am I doing this for? An assignment that you turn in for me as an English professor is going to be much different than an assignment you turn in for a biology professor, for instance. You obviously think about more in this class, grammar and spelling and the organization of your essays, versus maybe your biology professor wants you to focus more on whatever research you're doing or whatever experiments you're doing or whatever sort of, I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been in a biology class, to be honest. I don't really remember what we did in that. But suffice it to say, think about who am I doing this for? Think about the genre conventions for this type of assignment. Do they want you to use a citation format like APA? Do they expect you to use paragraphs? Do they expect you to use complete sentences? Ask those questions every single time. Stance. What kind of tone should I use for this? In all the essays for this class, you're using an academic tone. But in other classes, they might not ask you to use an academic tone, or they might ask you to write in a creative writing class. Obviously, you're going to use a very informal tone most of the time, where you're just kind of being maybe more emotional or using I, all those sorts of things. And then thinking about medium, how am I presenting this information? Is it an essay? Is it a video? Do I have to design a website or a pamphlet? all those sorts of things. So if you ask yourself these questions, and often they'll be found on the assignment sheets that your professors give you, it will pretty much guarantee that you at least succeed more than the average student. Okay, so very last thing that you need to do for this week, if you've ticked off all the boxes on the other things that are on the announcements page, is the week 2 discussion board activity, which is connected with this PowerPoint. So you're going to practice identifying the rhetorical situation of an essay by Jesmyn Ward. I will give a trigger warning for this essay, as it does deal with both COVID-19 and the death of her husband. So keep that in mind as you're reading it, and if you do need some sort of accommodation because either of those topics are too triggering for you, please let me know, and I can figure something out for that. Otherwise, good luck with your assignments this week, and I will see you on Microsoft Teams on Monday for our very first sort of in-person meeting.